If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The sky over eastern France was a flat sheet of gray when Lieutenant Marcus Hale's P-51 Mustang took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. He felt the impact through the control stick, sharp, violent, and final. The aircraft rolled hard to the right. Warning lights flickered. Smoke filled the cockpit. He smelled fuel. He knew right away the plane wouldn't make it back to Allied territory. Marcus's pulse kicked into a faster rhythm. He forced the Mustang level, fighting the shaking controls. The engine coughed and rattled under his boots. He scanned the frozen forest spreading in every direction below him. There was no safe place to land, only uneven ground and rows of thick conifers. But a crash in the trees was better than falling from the sky in pieces. Keep it together, straighten out, aim for the gap. His thoughts were short and controlled, shaped from years of training. But fear pressed on his chest anyway. He had survived 2 years of war. He was not ready to die today, not in a forest and not alone. The plane tore through the trees with a blast of splintered wood. Branches smashed against the wings. The left landing gear snapped off on impact. The Mustang slammed into the earth, plowing through snow and frozen soil before grinding to a halt. Marcus's head snapped forward into the pad behind the gun sight. Everything went quiet except for his own harsh breathing. He sat frozen in the cockpit for several seconds, disoriented and shaking. Cold air rushed in through the cracked canopy. He checked his body, sore ribs, a sharp burn across his shoulder from the harness, cuts on his knuckles. Nothing fatal. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Get out. Move now. Germans will come. His legs trembled when he climbed out of the cockpit and dropped into the knee-deep snow. The Mustang looked worse from the outside. Bent propellers, a crushed nose, one wing twisted. He ran gloved fingers along the fuselage. The damage was severe. Repairing it in a normal hangar would be difficult. Doing it in the middle of a forest felt impossible. Marcus brushed snow off his flight jacket and scanned the trees. The forest was silent, but he knew patrols would search the crash site soon. He grabbed a small bag of tools, a map, emergency rations, and his sidearm, then dragged broken branches over the aircraft to hide it as best as he could. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he moved deeper into the woods, each step crunching loudly under the snow. He walked with a limp, likely a bruise or strain, nothing serious, but the pain slowed him down. More concerning was the cold sinking into his bones. He needed shelter. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then he saw it, a thin stream of smoke rising from behind a ridge. He crouched behind a fallen tree, studying the direction. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was alive out here. He considered turning away. If it was German, he'd be dead before he drew his pistol. But he had no choice. His body was getting colder, and staying exposed was a slow death. If it's friendly, I survive the night. If it's not, I'll deal with it. He moved closer, stepping carefully around frozen branches, keeping his hand on his holster. When he reached the cabin, he stopped several meters away. It was an old lumber hut, walls darkened from age, one shutter hanging crooked. Light flickered inside. Someone was definitely there. He approached the door quietly and pushed it open with the barrel of his pistol. A woman gasped and stumbled back, clutching a wrench as if it were a blade. She looked ready to swing. Marcus lowered his weapon, slowly. "American," he said in a low voice. "Pilot." I crashed nearby. The woman's breathing was fast and shaky. She kept the wrench raised but did not attack. Her clothing was worn, patched multiple times. Her cheeks were hollow from hunger. Dark smudges under her eyes showed exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. She studied him with suspicion, then exhaled sharply. "French resistance," she answered. "My name is Elise Moreau." Her voice was tired but steady. She kept a defensive stance, and Marcus didn't blame her. Trust was dangerous in the forest. "You working alone?" Marcus asked. "My group was taken," she said. 2 days ago. Germans swept the area. I survived because I wasn't there when they came." She looked down at the wrench, gripping it tighter. "I've been hiding here since." Marcus felt a shift inside him, something like recognition. He knew the look she carried, the weight of being the one who lived when others didn't. It was a quiet, heavy guilt he had carried since losing his younger brother during the North Africa campaign. Why him? Why not me? That question had followed him for months. Elise stepped back cautiously and looked him over. "You're injured." "I've been worse," Marcus said. "I need shelter, and I need help. My aircraft is down, but not beyond repair." Elise's eyes narrowed. "You want to fix it here? It's my only way out, and I can't let the plane fall into German hands." She hesitated, running her thumb along the metal of the wrench. She was exhausted. Her knees slightly trembled, and her lips were pale from the cold. But she was thinking clearly. Fixing a P-51 in a forest was madness, but leaving a working American aircraft for Germans to salvage was even worse. "What is your mission?" she asked. "Escort and reconnaissance," Marcus answered. "Our unit is mapping German reinforcement lines. That Mustang carries film and intel. They can't capture it." Elise considered this, then slowly lowered the wrench. "My mission," she said quietly, "is to stay alive long enough to keep fighting. If I help you repair your plane, you go back and continue the fight from the sky. Maybe that matters more than hiding here until the Germans find me." Marcus nodded once. Her logic was sharp and direct, the kind used by people who had already lost too much. "Can you work with engines?" he asked. Elise let out a faint, humorless breath. "I rebuilt half the Resistance's vehicles by myself." "Show me the plane." Her voice steadied, and Marcus felt his tension loosen, not from safety, but from the sudden certainty that he had found the only person in this forest who could help him. They set out together into the snow. Marcus walked stiffly, fighting the ache in his ribs. Elise moved with caution, eyes scanning the trees for danger. Neither spoke. Neither trusted the other fully. But they shared the same instinct for survival and the same understanding of loss. When they reached the hidden Mustang, Elise froze at the sight of it. Bent, broken, half buried in frozen mud. She walked toward it slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. She touched the damaged engine cowling with careful, practiced hands. "We can fix this," she said. "Not easily, not quickly, but it's possible." Marcus felt the first real surge of relief since the crash. He didn't say it out loud. He only nodded. The forest stood silent around them, and the snow kept falling, covering the ground where their tracks already began to disappear. Their partnership, uneasy, fragile, but necessary, had begun. Cold air seeped through the trees as Marcus and Elise stood beside the damaged Mustang. The engine cowling was bent inward, the left propeller blade twisted at an unnatural angle, and the landing gear was half buried in frozen soil. Elise crouched immediately, inspecting the damage with the quick, efficient movements of someone who knew machines better than people. Marcus watched her, trying to judge what she was thinking, but her face stayed focused and unreadable. She brushed snow off the intake panel and ran her fingers along the cracked metal. "The engine mount is damaged," she said. "Propeller shaft too. If that shaft's alignment is off even slightly, the entire aircraft will shake itself apart during takeoff." Marcus nodded, aware this matched what he feared. "Can it be fixed out here?" "It won't be perfect," Elise replied. "But we don't need perfect. We need functional." She glanced up at him. "We'll have to rebuild them out with pieces from whatever we can find." "The clearing you picked for takeoff, how long is it?" "Barely enough," Marcus said. "I only spotted it from above for a moment. There's no real runway in this forest." "Then the propeller must spin smooth enough to avoid vibration," she said. "And you must lift off the first time. There is no space for trying again." The directness of her tone grounded him. She wasn't trying to reassure him. She was telling him the truth, and the truth mattered more than comfort. Marcus respected that. They began clearing the snow around the aircraft, lifting pieces of broken bark and branches Marcus had used to conceal it. The more they uncovered, the more Elise saw cracked fuel lines, a damaged coolant hose, and a tear along the lower edge of the fuselage panel. She stood and brushed her hands off. "We need tools. More than what you have in that bag. There's a burned-out transport truck about 2 kilometers north," Marcus said. It belonged to a German supply convoy we ambushed 3 weeks ago. There might be parts. Elise's eyes stayed sharp. And patrols. Likely, she thought for a moment, clearly weighing risk against necessity. Then she gave a short nod. We'll go at dusk. Germans move less in the dark. Marcus noted the slight tremor in her arms. She hadn't eaten enough. She hadn't rested enough. Her body was held together by determination rather than strength. He stepped toward the bag he'd dragged out of the cockpit and pulled out an emergency ration. Eat, he said. She hesitated, pride tightening her jaw, but she accepted it when she realized he wasn't offering out of pity. Thank you, she said quietly. They walked back to the cabin together, both scanning the woods for movement. The forest was silent, except for the sound of their boots sinking into snow. When they stepped inside, Elise closed the door tightly and checked the single window, making sure no one could see the firelight. Marcus sat near the weak flames, removing his gloves to warm his fingers. Elise joined him after a minute, placing the ration wrapper aside. The heat from the fire barely reached their backs, but it was enough to thaw the stiffness in their hands. She finally broke the silence. Why were you flying alone? P-51s usually operate in groups. Marcus had expected the question. Most listeners would wonder the same. We were escorting reconnaissance bombers, he said. My wingman took a hit over the river. I peeled off to cover him, and Flat caught me during the turn. He made it back. I didn't. Elise listened, her expression changing slightly. Less guarded, more understanding. And the film inside your plane? You said it mattered. It shows German troop movements near the central rail line, Marcus said. If command sees the footage, they'll redirect pressure. It could save units from walking into ambushes. So repairing your plane isn't just for escape, Elise said. It changes the war here. It helps, Marcus answered. That's enough reason. Elise looked at the flames, her voice lowering. My group died, trying to slow those same movements. If what's in your plane exposes their routes, then we finish what they started. Her words were steady, but Marcus caught the faint shift in her breathing. She was still carrying the weight of being the one who lived. It was a familiar burden. Marcus felt a quiet pull of empathy, unexpected but firm. After a short rest, they moved outside again. Evening had settled in, bringing deeper shadows and a sharper cold. Marcus adjusted his holster. Elise wrapped a scarf she had sewn from scrap cloth around her neck. Together, they headed north toward the wrecked transport truck. The forest floor crackled under their boots. Every sound felt amplified. Marcus stayed alert, scanning the trees for shapes that didn't belong. Elise moved closer than earlier, not out of fear, but to match his pace and rely on his awareness. When they reached the truck, its charred frame stood half covered in snow. The burn marks were old, metal warped and brittle. Elise approached it first, checking the underside for anything useful. She found a section of steel bracket still intact and a collection of bolts protected under a collapsed panel. These will work, she said, forcing the metal loose with controlled strength. They're not aircraft parts, but if we reshape them, the engine mount can hold. Marcus knelt beside her and helped gather the pieces. He kept his ears tuned for movement, but the forest stayed still. Elise worked with speed, pushing aside debris, scanning for anything that could mimic a fitting, clamp, or brace. When she stood again, her breath was heavy, but her posture looked firmer. She had a plan forming in her mind. Marcus could see it in her expression. We have enough to start, she said. Tomorrow, we'll test the fuel lines and see how much of the propeller shaft we can straighten. It won't be easy. It doesn't need to be easy, Marcus replied. It just needs to work. As they made their way back to the cabin, the moonlight gave the snow a faint glow. Elise walked with a quieter step now, and Marcus sensed her mindset shifting from simple survival to focused intent. They were no longer strangers sharing a forest. They were partners working toward the same goal. Inside the cabin, Elise hung her scarf to dry and checked her tools. Marcus rested against the wall, watching her with careful attention. She moved with precision, not wasting motion. She was tired, but the more she worked, the more her confidence surfaced. For the first time since the crash, Marcus felt something close to relief. Elise's skills, her judgment, and her will to keep fighting. Those were their lifeline. Elise finally sat down near the fire, rubbing her sore hands. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we start turning that wreck into a plane again." Marcus nodded. "We will." Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls, and the forest remained silent. Inside, the tension between them eased, just enough for the room to feel less cold, less uncertain. Their survival was no longer a question of luck. It was a question of work, grit, and trust earned slowly through necessity. And the real repair of the plane and of themselves had only just begun. The next morning arrived with a heavy cold that seeped through the cabin walls long before sunrise. Elise woke first, sitting up slowly, rubbing stiffness from her hands. Marcus followed a moment later, pushing against the ache in his ribs as he pulled on his jacket. Neither spoke much. The silence between them was no longer tense, just focused. They stepped out into the forest, the snow crunching under their boots as pale daylight filtered through the trees. Elise paused halfway to the Mustang, studying the footprints they had left the previous day. A thin layer of fresh snow had softened them, but not erased them. "They're faint," she said, "but still visible. We need to cover them after each trip." Marcus nodded. It was a detail he knew listeners would wonder about, how they avoided leading patrols straight to the hidden plane. Elise's careful attention to every risk closed that gap. When they reached the Mustang, the frozen metal glinted under the early light. Elise knelt immediately, pulling tools from the makeshift bag and setting them in a neat line beside her. Marcus joined her, crouching near the damaged propeller shaft. She ran her fingers along the bend in the shaft with slow precision. "If we force it too hard, it'll snap. If we do too little, it'll vibrate during takeoff and tear itself loose." She reached for a length of metal brackets scavenged from the burn truck. "We'll use this as a brace. It's not ideal, but it might hold." Marcus steadied the shaft as Elise adjusted the bracket, her breath steady and controlled despite the cold reddening her fingertips. "You have done this before?" he asked. "Not with aircraft," she admitted, tightening a clamp. "But resistance vehicles often needed repairs in ditches or barns. I learned to solve problems with whatever was left after explosions." Marcus watched her face as she worked. Her focus didn't waver. She wasn't improvising randomly. She was analyzing, judging weight and tension with instincts sharpened by loss and necessity. It explained what many would wonder: how Elise became so skilled despite having no formal training. As they aligned the brace, Marcus felt the strain in his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, but didn't stop. Elise noticed. "You need a minute?" she asked. "No," Marcus replied. "We're losing daylight." She didn't argue, but she slowed her pace slightly, choosing tasks that used her strength instead of his. It was a quiet, thoughtful adjustment, something she didn't draw attention to. By midday, they had managed to reinforce the engine mount and straighten the propeller shaft enough for testing. Elise wiped oil from her hands, her breath clouding in the air. "We try a cold rotation," she said, "just enough to see if it turns evenly." Marcus climbed into the cockpit. The seat was icy, and the cracked canopy creaked when he pulled it halfway closed. Elise stood by the nose of the plane, ready to listen. Marcus primed the starter. The engine sputtered once, rattling the airframe before falling silent. Elise leaned closer to the engine housing. Again, he tried a second time. The propeller jerked, rotated halfway, and stopped with a hard metallic clunk. Marcus exhaled sharply. "Shaft?" "No." Elise pressed her ear against the panel. "Fuel blockage. Ice in the line." She moved quickly around the side of the plane, pulling open the lower access panel. Marcus joined her, and together they cleaned the frost buildup and wrapped a cloth around the line to warm it with their hands. As they worked, Elise spoke quietly, her voice steady but more personal than it had been the day before. "I was supposed to evacuate with my unit," she said. "They wanted me in the back fields, keeping engines running. But I refused. I stayed with them on the road." She tightened a clamp, her fingers trembling slightly. "When the Germans came, they told me to run because I was the one who could repair things later. I listened, and now they're gone." Marcus didn't look away from the fuel line. You didn't run because you were afraid. You ran because they trusted you to survive. Elise's jaw tightened, but her breathing steadied. She didn't argue. He understood her conflict deeply. After his brother died, he had replayed the moment again and again, wondering what he should have done differently. Loss left questions that never felt answered. When the line was clear, Marcus climbed back into the cockpit. Elise stood in front, watching the propeller intently. He engaged the starter again. This time, the engine coughed, took a breath, and caught for a full 3 seconds before Elise signaled him to cut it. Marcus shut it down, heart pounding from the sudden shift of hope. Elise stepped back, her eyes fixed on the engine housing. "It works," she said. "Not ready for flight, but it works." There was no smile, no dramatic shift in her face, just a quiet, controlled satisfaction. For her, progress was a duty, not a celebration. They paused to eat a small ration near the wing. Elise divided the food evenly, pushing half toward Marcus without a word. She didn't want thanks. She wanted efficiency. As they ate, Marcus asked, "How long do you think we have until patrols return to this area?" 2 days, Elise said. "Maybe less. The snow helps hide the plane, but the Germans move unpredictably. They sweep areas in patterns I don't fully understand." Her voice lowered. "But repairing the fuselage seam and checking the coolant system will take at least another full day. So we work through tomorrow and fly out on the next sunrise," Marcus said. Elise nodded slowly. "That gives us one chance. Only one." When they finished eating, they continued repairing the fuselage tear. Elise hammered the metal plates gently, muffling the sound with layers of cloth. Marcus held the panel steady, his muscles burning from effort he tried not to show. Throughout the work, Elise made small observations, details that answered the kinds of questions any listener would wonder about. "We'll need to use snow to cool the engine before takeoff. It overheats easily after field repairs. We must pack down the clearing tonight so the wheels don't sink. We should move in silence tomorrow morning. Germans patrol early." Each statement was practical, grounded, and essential. By late afternoon, their hands were raw and stiff from the cold, but the Mustang looked less like wreckage and more like a machine that might live again. "Enough for today," Elise said, stepping back to examine their progress. Marcus followed her gaze. The reinforced engine mount held firm. The paneling was secure. The propeller shaft rotated cleanly by hand. They were not finished, but they were no longer fighting a hopeless battle. On the walk back to the cabin, the light dimmed behind the trees, turning the forest into a maze of shadows. Elise walked close to Marcus, scanning the surroundings carefully. "You trust me now?" she asked suddenly, not looking at him. Marcus considered his answer. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, but she had stood beside him all day, pushing through exhaustion, fear, and memories she barely spoke about. "I trust your skill," he said, "and your judgment." Elise didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "That's enough." Inside the cabin, they prepared their tools for the next day. Elise wrapped her hands in cloth to keep them from cracking in the cold. Marcus tightened his boots and checked his sidearm. Tomorrow would be their longest day yet. It was the final stretch between survival and failure, between escape and capture. And as the fire crackled weakly in the corner, both of them felt the same truth settling in. They were no longer just repairing a plane. They were building the only path that could carry them both out of the forest alive. Night settled over the forest with a deeper cold than the day before, locking the ground in a hard, frozen crust. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, throwing uneven light across the walls. Marcus and Elise moved through the cramped space quietly, preparing their final tools, rechecking every piece of equipment they planned to carry in the morning. No one said it out loud, but both understood that the next day would decide everything. When dawn finally broke, the sky was a washed-out gray. The light gave the snow a dull shine, enough to see by, but not enough to ease the tension in the air. Marcus tightened the strap of his holster, feeling the stiffness in his ribs flare each time he breathed too deeply. Elise wrapped cloth around her palms to protect the cracked skin from the cold. She looked exhausted yet steady, the the kind of steady that comes from committing fully to a task, no matter the outcome. They walked to the clearing without speaking. Every step echoed the tension that had been slowly tightening since the engine first started turning. Snow coated the branches, and the forest held a stillness that felt too sharp, as if something was waiting. The Mustang stood where they had left it, covered in a thin layer of frost. Elise approached the engine, housing immediately, brushing away ice with controlled, practiced motions. Marcus circled to the tail section to inspect the stabilizer. Ice had formed along the edge, and he cleared it with careful strokes of his glove. Elise joined him a moment later. "If the tail drags when you lift off, you'll lose speed," she said. "We'll pack the runway again before testing the engine." The clearing they had chosen was narrow, barely enough room to run up the engine before lifting off. Last night, they had tamped the snow down with planks and their own boots, but new frost had settled on top. Elise judged the surface with a long look. "We'll do it again," she said. "It has to be as firm as possible." Marcus gathered the planks while Elise used the flat of her boots to level the snow. They worked side by side, pushing through the cold air and the weight of what was coming. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was necessary, a shared focus between two people who understood the stakes without needing to restate them. When the ground was ready, Elise stepped back and checked the length of the clearing. "This is the best it will get," she said. Marcus nodded once. "Let's warm the engine." He climbed into the cockpit and took a steadying breath. Elise stood by the nose, watching everything closely. He engaged the primer, then the starter. The engine coughed, choked, and then rumbled to life, louder than before, steadier than anything they'd heard from in days. Elise checked the vibration through her palms and looked toward Marcus with a short, tight nod. "Throttle up slowly," she called. He eased the throttle forward. The propeller spun cleanly, the mounted brace holding firm, the repaired shaft turning without violent shaking. The noise cut through the forest, echoing between the trees. Elise's eyes darted toward the ridge. Sound carried. Anyone nearby could hear it. She signaled Marcus to shut it down. The sudden silence after the roar felt heavy. Elise moved around the engine, checking clamps and bolts. Marcus climbed out of the cockpit, watching her expression carefully. "It's stable," she said. "Almost too stable. I wasn't sure we would get this far." Marcus exhaled, the breath fogging in the air. "Then we fly tomorrow." "Not tomorrow," Elise said quietly. "Today." Marcus stiffened. "Why today?" She lowered her voice, though there was no one visible in the trees. "I saw new tracks near the ridge. 2 different patterns. They crossed the road last night. They're scouting farther south than before." He scanned the trees immediately, instincts kicking in. "How much time?" "Not enough," she said. "They could sweep this area by afternoon." Marcus processed the information in silence. She wasn't guessing. Her expression was too precise for that. They had pushed the repairs to the limit. Waiting would only increase the danger. If Germans found the Mustang, the mission would be over, the footage would be lost, and Elise would be killed on sight as a resistance member. He nodded. "Then we finish now." They spent the next hour making final adjustments. Elise bled air from the coolant system, tightened every bolt she could reach, and added snow to cool the engine casing. Marcus checked the cockpit instruments, ensuring the throttle and stick responded smoothly. When everything was done, Elise stepped back and looked at the plane with an expression that mixed fatigue, pride, and a quiet resignation. She had put days of work, strength, and resolve into a machine she would not get to see fly from inside. "Once you lift off, climb straight and stay low until you clear the tree line," she said. "If you bank too early, the left wing could dip into the drift." "I'll clear it," Marcus answered. "And don't push the engine hard until you're above the valley." She swallowed. "It can handle takeoff, but it's not ready for combat power." "I'll keep it steady." Elise stepped closer and rested her hand on the side of the fuselage. Her glove left a faint, clean mark on the frost. She held it there for a long moment, as if feeling the resonance of everything they had done. Every long night, every risk, every small victory that had led to this moment. Marcus watched her hand, then her face. She kept her expression controlled, but he could see the strain beneath it, The fear of being left alone again, the pain of watching someone else depart into danger, the worry that all their work might still end in failure. She looked at him, and for a moment neither tried to hide anything. "You should go before the patrols move in," she said. "I know." She stepped back as Marcus climbed into the cockpit. He secured the harness, lowered the canopy, and looked out through the cracked edge of the glass. Elise stood a few paces away, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her eyes fixed on him with steady determination. He started the engine. Its roar filled the clearing, scattering birds from the trees. Elise lifted her hand slightly, not a wave, but a gesture of recognition. Marcus returned it with a faint nod. He pushed the throttle and felt the Mustang roll forward, tires crunching against the packed snow. The clearing rushed past, the trees narrowing into a tunnel ahead. He held the stick firm, trusting every hour Elise had spent repairing this machine. The plane gained speed. The tail lifted, the nose steadied, and then the wheels left the ground. The Mustang climbed above the tree line, clearing the branches by only a small margin, but climbing cleanly into the gray winter sky. Below, Elise stood unmoving in the clearing, watching until the aircraft disappeared behind the clouds. Marcus kept the plane steady, the engine humming with surprising strength. He flew low until the ridge dropped away beneath him, then turned toward Allied territory. Behind him, the forest shrank into distance. Ahead, the sky opened wide. He didn't look back, but he carried the memory of Elise's steady gaze with him as clearly as the instruments glowing on the control panel. The Mustang cut through the low winter clouds with a steady hum that surprised Marcus. He had expected vibration, instability, anything that might force him back toward the forest he had barely escaped. Instead, the engine held firm, each rotation smooth and controlled. Elise's repairs, rushed, improvised, and daring, were holding together under strain. He kept the aircraft low for several kilometers, following the tree line until the land dipped into a shallow valley. Only then did he climb, watching the altimeter rise as the horizon opened in front of him. The enemy-held territory beneath him looked quiet from the air. Snow-covered roads, thin columns of smoke from farmhouses, and a faint trace of tire tracks crossing frozen soil. But he didn't linger. His fuel was limited, and the engine could only be pushed so far. He adjusted his heading toward the Allied front lines, focusing on the landscape ahead, forcing himself not to think about the forest clearing shrinking behind him. After nearly an hour of careful flight, he spotted the first familiar contour of Allied-held ground: sandbag positions, camouflage tents, and a cluster of repair trucks. Marcus exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening for the first time since the crash. He signaled his approach, and the ground crew scrambled as the Mustang descended toward the small airstrip carved out of the winter terrain. The landing was rough. The wheels hit hard, bouncing once before gripping the snow-packed dirt. The plane rolled to a stop, smoke rising lightly from the engine housing after the strain of the final climb. As Marcus opened the canopy, cold air rushed in, bringing a sharp reminder of how far he had traveled. Soldiers ran toward him, calling out his name and pulling him from the cockpit. One of the mechanics stared wide-eyed at the reinforced brackets and uneven paneling Elise had installed. "What the hell happened out there?" one asked. Marcus shook his head, too tired for explanations yet. "The film," he said. "Get the film out first." They recovered the reconnaissance footage, rushing it toward the command building. Only after handing it off did Marcus allow himself to sit on the back of an ambulance truck, rubbing warmth into his numb hands. Over the next days, he gave his report: how he crashed, how he survived, and how he repaired the Mustang with the help of a lone resistance mechanic hiding deep in the forest. Allied officers studied the footage and confirmed its importance. Dozens of German troop movements, hidden supply lines, and disguised artillery positions were exposed because the film had returned intact. New operations began forming immediately. Marcus kept flying missions, each sortie pushing him farther from the forest he had left behind. But Elise stayed in his mind with a clarity he couldn't shake. The calm way she worked, the quiet strength in her voice, the steady gaze she had held during takeoff. He wondered if she was safe. He wondered if the patrols had moved north and found a clearing. He wondered whether she was still hiding, still fighting, still breathing in that cold cabin with only silence for company. Weeks passed before he received news. Resistance activity had increased, coordinated, precise, and effective. Allied pilots reported seeing signals from the forest outside the town of Saint Etienne, and local scouts mentioned a mechanic helping newly formed units repair stolen German vehicles. The description fit her exactly. Then came the liberation. Marcus was flying a low escort mission during the final push when he saw the town from above. Civilians emerging from basements, resistance fighters directing Allied troops down safe paths, smoke drifting from burning German equipment. At the edge of the road, he spotted a figure working beside a truck's open hood, her movements sharp and confident. He dipped the Mustang's wings, once then twice. Elise looked up. Her scarf blew back in the wind as she stepped away from the vehicle, recognizing the motion immediately despite the distance. She didn't smile or wave. She simply stood straight, watching as the plane banked over the rooftops. By the time Marcus landed at the makeshift field outside town, the afternoon light had faded into a soft, cold dusk. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaking from the long flight and the weight of anticipation. A jeep arrived minutes later, carrying an officer who motioned him over. "There's someone asking for you," the officer said. "French mechanic. Said you'd understand who she is." Marcus nodded and followed. At the far end of the field, Elise stood waiting near a supply tent. She looked the same as he remembered, tired, sharp-eyed, steady, but now there was a small warmth in her expression that hadn't been there in the forest. He walked toward her, stopping just a few steps away. She met his gaze without hesitation. "You made it," she said. "So did you," he answered. They stood in silence, the same kind that had shaped their days in the forest, but here it carried something lighter. Marcus took a step closer. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," he said quietly. Elise's breath turned to fog in the cold air. "I didn't plan to stay hidden forever," she replied. "You gave me a reason to keep moving." He studied her face, the calm strength behind her eyes. She had rebuilt him just as much as she had rebuilt the Mustang, though neither of them had said aloud. "How long will you be with the resistance?" Marcus asked. "Until the region is secured," she said. "After that, I don't know." Her voice softened. "I have no home to return to. Not anymore." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then, come north with us when you're ready. My unit can use someone who understands engines better than half her crew." Her eyes lowered for a moment, considering. When she looked back up, there was no hesitation left. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." He reached out, and she stepped into his arms without resistance. The embrace was firm and grounded, the kind shared by people who had survived together and chose not to walk separate paths anymore. In the background, the Mustang they had rebuilt stood silent on the field, its patched metal still holding strong. Soldiers moved around it, preparing for the next day's operations. But for Marcus and Elise, the war had shifted into something they could face side by side. Above them, the winter sky cleared slowly, revealing a pale band of stars, cold, steady, and promising a future that no longer felt uncertain. Their story, born in silence and built through survival, now moved forward with a clearer purpose. Together,